Eleanor Jenkins had no idea that offering shelter to a stranded family during a catastrophic flash flood would lead to the discovery of historic Supreme Court documents hidden in her grandfather's century-old farmhouse cellar for over 40 years, transforming her from a debt-ridden elderly veteran facing foreclosure into the custodian of legal treasures worth $67 million that would reshape the understanding of American constitutional interpretation for generations to come. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. At 72 years old, Eleanor Jenkins was staring at her sixth consecutive month of missed mortgage payments that had transformed her family's century-old farm in rural Vermont into a financial nightmare, threatening to cost her the only home she had known since returning from military service in Vietnam nearly 5 decades ago. As she sat at her weathered oak kitchen table on a stormy Thursday evening in July 2024, surrounded by foreclosure notices and past due bills, Eleanor was calculating whether she had enough money left in her dwindling savings to keep the electricity on for another month before the bank's final deadline arrived in exactly 21 days. The certified letter from Northern Vermont Banking Corporation lay open beside her chipped ceramic mug like a death sentence, its formal language reducing 47 years of farming, hard work and perseverance to a series of missed payments and legal procedures. Notice of foreclosure proceedings, the header read in bold black letters, followed by the crushing mathematics of financial failure, $143,700 in remaining mortgage principal, $17,820 in accumulated unpaid interest over the past 6 months, and precisely 21 days to somehow produce a minimum payment of $29,500 that Eleanor knew she didn't have and couldn't possibly earn in time to save the 175-acre farm that had been in her family for 4 generations. Eleanor's monthly income from her veteran's disability pension and the modest Social Security benefits she received had remained fixed at $2,640, while her expenses, property taxes, insurance, utilities, medical costs, equipment maintenance, and food had steadily increased to nearly $3,800 per month. The gap between income and expenses had been manageable as long as the farm had produced enough revenue to cover the difference. But 3 consecutive years of declining crop yields due to increasingly unpredictable weather patterns had depleted her emergency savings and pushed her into the financial abyss she now faced. The white clapboard farmhouse with its wraparound porch and red barn had been built by Eleanor's great-grandfather, William Jenkins, in 1903, when he had established the property as a dairy and apple operation that had once been among the most productive in Caledonia County. The farm had passed from generation to generation, sustaining the Jenkins family through 2 world wars, the Great Depression, and the agricultural challenges of the late 20th century. Eleanor had inherited the property from her father in 1977, when she returned from Vietnam with a Purple Heart, a permanent limp from shrapnel wounds, and nightmares that still occasionally woke her more than 50 years later. The farm had been Eleanor's sanctuary after the trauma of war, providing physical work that had helped her recover from injuries and a connection to family heritage that had given purpose to a life that had seemed shattered by her experiences. As an army nurse, treating wounded soldiers in field hospitals where death and suffering had been daily companions, the methodical rhythm of farm work, planting in spring, tending through summer, harvesting in fall, and planning during winter, had provided structure and meaning when military service had left her questioning humanity's capacity for both cruelty and courage. For nearly 5 decades, Eleanor had maintained the farm as a modestly successful operation, producing apples, maple syrup, and organic vegetables that she sold at local markets and to restaurants throughout Vermont's Northeast Kingdom. The property had never made her wealthy, but it had provided enough income to support a simple, dignified life centered around the land, the changing seasons, and the rural community that had welcomed her home from war and had respected her quiet, competence, and unwavering work ethic. The financial crisis that now threatened to destroy her life's work had begun 3 years earlier, when unprecedented spring flooding had damaged nearly half of her apple orchard, destroying trees that had been producing fruit for over 40 years and would require at least a decade to replace with new plantings. The following year, an early autumn freeze had devastated her maple production, reducing syrup output by nearly 60% and forcing her to cancel contracts with several restaurants and specialty food shops that had been reliable customers. For decades, the third consecutive year of agricultural disaster had come in the form of a summer drought that had required expensive irrigation of her vegetable fields, doubling her electricity costs while reducing yields by nearly 40%. The combination of increased expenses and decreased revenue had quickly consumed Eleanor's modest savings and had forced her to begin missing mortgage payments for the first time since she had refinanced the property 15 years earlier to invest in modern equipment and improved irrigation systems. Eleanor had exhausted every resource available to aging farmers in rural Vermont, applying for emergency agricultural relief through the Department of Agriculture, financial assistance through veteran support programs, and low-interest loans. Through rural development initiatives, most programs had waiting lists measured in months rather than weeks, application requirements that her limited technological skills made difficult to navigate, or criteria that she couldn't quite meet despite the legitimate nature of her financial emergency. The Vermont Agricultural Emergency Relief Fund had provided her with a one-time grant of $7,500 that had covered 2 mortgage payments, but the program's annual budget had been depleted by similar requests from farmers throughout the state who were facing economic challenges created by changing climate patterns and increasing operational costs. The Veterans Financial Assistance Program had been able to provide temporary relief for her utility bills, but couldn't address the substantial mortgage debt that threatened her property ownership. Eleanor had also attempted to address her crisis by seeking additional income sources, but the combination of her age, her physical limitations from war injuries, and the isolated location of her farm had made it nearly impossible to find supplementary employment that was compatible with maintaining the agricultural operation that represented her only significant asset and potential source of long-term financial stability. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The few retail and service jobs available in St. Johnsbury, the nearest town of significant size, required physical capabilities that Eleanor's injuries made impossible or offered hourly wages so low that transportation costs would consume most of the additional income. At 72, with a pronounced limp and chronic pain from her combat injuries, Eleanor found herself caught in the cruel arithmetic of rural poverty, too young for enhanced elderly benefits, too physically limited for manual labor, too geographically isolated for service employment, and too financially strapped to relocate to an area with better economic opportunities. The emotional impact of potential foreclosure extended far beyond the practical challenges of where she would live and how she would support herself. The farm represented her family's heritage, her personal identity, and her contribution to a rural community that was already losing agricultural properties to development, recreational use, and corporate ownership. The thought of being the Jenkins, who lost the family farm after 4 generations of careful stewardship, created a sense of failure and shame that was almost as painful as the prospect of homelessness. Eleanor had developed increasing symptoms of anxiety and depression as the financial crisis had intensified, experiencing difficulty sleeping, loss of appetite, and periods of hopelessness that sometimes made it difficult to complete the daily farm tasks that had once provided structure and purpose to her life. The physical manifestations of chronic stress, headaches, digestive problems, elevated blood pressure, had further complicated her existing health challenges from age and war injuries, creating a downward spiral of decreasing productivity and increasing medical expenses. The farm buildings themselves had begun to show signs of deferred maintenance that Eleanor could no longer afford to address, with the barn roof developing leaks that threatened stored equipment, the chicken coop needing structural repairs before winter, and the farmhouse requiring exterior painting to protect the wooden siding from Vermont's harsh weather. Each unaddressed maintenance issue represented not just a decline in property value, but a visible symbol of Eleanor's inability to maintain the standards of care that had characterized her family's approach to farming for over a century. Despite these challenges, Eleanor had maintained her dignity and privacy, sharing the full extent of her financial crisis only with her attorney and financial advisor, both of whom had exhausted their professional resources trying to find solutions that would allow her to keep the farm while restructuring her debt into manageable payments. Her neighbors and community members knew she was facing difficulties. The reduced scale of her farmers' market participation and the unharvested sections of her fields told that story clearly enough. But she had kept the imminent foreclosure, or private, unwilling to accept charity, or to become the subject of community concern and conversation. The farmhouse that had been the center of Eleanor's life contained historical features and architectural details that reflected its construction during the early 20th century, including a hand-dug cellar with stone foundation walls, original woodwork crafted from trees harvested on the property, and hidden spaces that had been designed during Prohibition to conceal family supplies of homemade hard cider and maple spirits from potential government inspection. One such hidden space was located in the cellar, behind what appeared to be a structural support wall, but was actually a cleverly designed sliding panel that concealed a small room approximately 8 feet square. Eleanor's grandfather, Thomas Jenkins, had constructed the hidden room during the 1920s, when federal prohibition agents had occasionally searched rural properties for illegal alcohol production. But the space had remained largely unused and unexplored since Eleanor's childhood. The hidden room was accessible only if one knew exactly which section of wall could be moved and how to operate the concealed mechanism that allowed the panel to slide without damaging the surrounding structure. Eleanor had shown the hidden room to her nephews when they were children visiting the farm during summer vacations, but as they had grown into adults with busy urban careers and families of their own, their visits had become increasingly infrequent and brief. The farm that had once been the gathering place for extended family celebrations had become primarily Eleanor's solitary domain, with holiday visits and occasional summer weekends representing her primary contact with relatives who respected her independence but worried about her isolation as she aged. Thomas Jenkins, who had constructed the hidden cellar room, had been more than just a Vermont farmer trying to protect his homemade spirits from government inspection. Before establishing himself as an agricultural producer, he had served as a law clerk to Supreme Court Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes, Jr. from 1916 to 1921, developing a deep understanding of constitutional law and forming connections with legal scholars that had continued long after he had returned to Vermont to take over the family farm when his father became ill. Thomas Jenkins had maintained correspondence with several Supreme Court justices and legal scholars throughout his life, collecting their letters, unpublished legal opinions, and personal reflections on significant cases in a series of leather-bound Journals that documented the private thoughts and legal reasoning of some of the most influential jurists in American history. The journals and related documents had been stored in the hidden cellar room, organized chronologically and protected from moisture and pests by the careful construction of sealed wooden cases lined with waxed canvas. Thomas had died in 1973, without fully explaining the historical significance of his legal collection to his son Henry, Eleanor's father, who had known about the hidden room but had viewed it primarily as an interesting family story rather than the repository of historically significant legal documents. Henry Jenkins had died in 1977, shortly after Eleanor's return from Vietnam, leaving her to manage the farm without complete knowledge of the historical treasures concealed within its walls. As Eleanor sat at her kitchen table on this stormy July evening in 2024, listening to thunder rolling across the Green Mountains and watching lightning illuminate the barn and surrounding fields, she was trying to calculate whether selling her father's collection of antique farm equipment might generate enough cash to make a minimum payment on the mortgage and buy a few more months of time to find a sustainable solution to her financial crisis. The collection, which included a 1939 John Deere Model B tractor, various implements from the 1930s through the 1950s, and hand tools that dated back to the farm's establishment, might bring $30,000 to $40,000 from collectors or museums interested in preserving agricultural heritage. But selling these items would eliminate her connection to her family's farming history and would represent a significant emotional loss, even if it temporarily resolved her financial emergency. The impossible mathematics of her situation had consumed Eleanor's thoughts for months as she tried to identify any possible combination of actions that might prevent foreclosure, while maintaining her ability to generate even modest income from the property that represented her only significant asset and her lifelong home. Even if she could somehow raise the $2,900 needed to satisfy the immediate demand from Northern Vermont Banking Corporation, she would still face the same monthly payment gap that had created the crisis, making it likely that she would fall behind again within a short time, unless her agricultural production improved dramatically or she found supplementary income sources that had so far proven elusive. Eleanor had even considered the possibility of reverse mortgage programs that would allow her to remain on the property while converting her equity into income. But most such programs required clean title with no existing mortgage debt, making them unavailable to her in her current situation. She had also explored the possibility of selling development rights or conservation easements to land trust organizations, but the complex legal requirements and extended timeframes for such arrangements made them impractical solutions for her immediate financial emergency. As the storm intensified outside her windows, Eleanor could hear branches breaking in the apple orchard as wind gusts approached 50 miles per hour, creating new property damage that she would need to address once the weather cleared, but lacked the financial resources to repair properly. The weather forecast had predicted rainfall of up to 4 inches over the next 12 hours, raising concerns about potential flooding along the stream that ran through the eastern section of her property and provided irrigation water for her vegetable fields. The irony of her situation was not lost on Eleanor, who had survived combat in Vietnam and half a century of agricultural challenges only to face the loss of her family heritage and personal sanctuary due to financial circumstances that seemed beyond her control despite decades of careful management and hard work. The state that had been her ancestral home was now the setting for a crisis that threatened to leave her homeless, at an age when starting over seemed almost impossible to contemplate. But Eleanor Jenkins had no idea that within hours, a family's desperate search for shelter during a historic flash flood would set in motion a discovery that would transform her dire financial situation into an opportunity beyond her most optimistic expectations. revealing that the farmhouse where she had spent most of her life contained historical treasures that would attract the attention of the highest levels of the American judicial system and provide the financial security that had seemed impossible. For an elderly veteran facing foreclosure in rural Vermont, the Jenkins family farm had been established in 1903 by William Jenkins, a first-generation Irish-American whose parents had immigrated to the United States during the potato famine of the 1840s and had initially settled in Boston before gradually moving north into rural New England in search of affordable land and agricultural opportunities. William had purchased the original 120 acres, with savings accumulated through 15 years of factory work in Massachusetts, fulfilling his immigrant father's dream of land ownership and self-sufficiency through agricultural production. The farm had originally focused on dairy production, with a herd of 25 Holstein cows providing milk that was processed into butter and cheese for local markets throughout Vermont's northeast kingdom. William Jenkins had gradually expanded the operation to include apple orchards, taking advantage of Vermont's climate and soil conditions that were ideal for certain hardy varieties that could withstand the region's harsh winters and short growing seasons. William's son, Thomas, had expanded the family business further during the 1920s and 1930s, adding maple syrup production, diversifying the apple varieties, and establishing direct sales relationships with markets and restaurants throughout Vermont and neighboring New Hampshire. Thomas had also been the first Jenkins to receive higher education, attending Dartmouth College and later Yale Law School before his clerkship with Justice Holmes and his eventual return to the family farm when his father's health began failing in 1921. The combination of Thomas Jenkins' legal, education and agricultural innovation had established the farm as one of the most successful operations in Caledonia County during the 1920s and 1930s, weathering the Great Depression more successfully than many neighboring properties due to its diversified production and Thomas's careful financial management. The farm had employed up to 15 seasonal workers during harvest periods and had supported an extended family network that included Thomas's parents, his wife Margaret, and their 3 children, including Henry, who would eventually inherit the property. The legal connections that Thomas had established during his Supreme Court clerkship and subsequent correspondence had been carefully maintained throughout his farming career, creating an unusual dual identity as both respected agricultural producer and knowledgeable legal scholar whose opinions were occasionally sought by former colleagues who had continued their legal careers while he had returned to rural Vermont. The hidden cellar room had become the repository of this legal correspondence, gradually accumulating documents, letters, and journals that Thomas considered historically significant but too private for casual access or public display. Henry Jenkins, Eleanor's father, had inherited the farm in 1958 when Thomas died at the age of 67, continuing the family's agricultural traditions while gradually modernizing production methods and equipment during the post-war economic expansion that had transformed American agriculture from primarily manual labor to increasingly mechanized operations. Henry had been a practical farmer rather than an intellectual or legal scholar, respecting his father's collection of legal documents, but not fully appreciating their historical significance or potential value. Eleanor had been born in 1952, growing up on the farm during the 1950s and 1960s and developing the agricultural skills and knowledge that would eventually allow her to become the 4th-generation steward of the family property. Her childhood had been characterized by the rhythmic patterns of farm life, with seasonal activities providing structure and purpose that connected her to the land, the changing Vermont seasons, and the family heritage that stretched back to her great-grandfather's immigrant dreams of land ownership and self-sufficiency. Eleanor's decision to become an army nurse during the Vietnam War had been motivated partly by patriotism and partly by a desire to acquire medical skills that would be useful for managing health issues that sometimes arose on isolated rural properties where professional medical care might not be immediately available. Her military service from 1971 to 1975 had exposed her to experiences of suffering, courage, and human resilience that had profoundly shaped her character and had given her perspectives on hardship that had helped her weather subsequent agricultural and financial challenges with stoicism and determination. Her return to the farm in 1977, following her father's death, had coincided with significant challenges in American agriculture, including rising energy costs, increasing competition from corporate farming operations, and fluctuating commodity prices that made small-scale production increasingly difficult to sustain profitably. Eleanor had adapted by gradually shifting toward specialty crops, organic production methods, and direct marketing through farmers' markets and restaurant relationships that eliminated middlemen and increased profit margins on smaller production volumes. For over 4 decades, this approach had allowed her to maintain the farm as a modestly successful operation while preserving its historical features, agricultural heritage, and family connections. The property had never generated significant wealth, but it had provided Eleanor with meaningful work, community connections, and the satisfaction of continuing her family's agricultural traditions while adapting them to changing market conditions and consumer preferences. The financial crisis that now threatened to end the Jenkins family's 121-year stewardship of the farm represented the convergence of agricultural challenges, changing climate patterns, increasing operational costs, and the limitations imposed by Eleanor's age and physical condition. The combination of these factors had created a situation that seemed to offer no viable solutions within the 21-day deadline imposed by Northern Vermont Banking Corporation's foreclosure process. As the storm continued to intensify outside Eleanor's windows, the National Weather Service issued a flash flood warning for Caledonia County, predicting rapid water level increases in streams and rivers throughout the region as the storm system dumped unprecedented rainfall on ground that was already saturated from previous weather events. The emergency alert system on Eleanor's phone activated with the distinctive tone that signaled imminent danger, providing information about evacuation routes and emergency shelter locations for residents in low-lying areas. Eleanor's farmhouse was situated on higher ground that had never experienced flooding in her lifetime, but the stream that ran through her eastern fields could potentially cut off road access if it overflowed its banks and washed out the small bridge that connected her property to the county road system. The possibility of temporary isolation due to flood conditions added another layer of concern to her already stressful situation, raising questions about access to medical care if her chronic pain from war injuries intensified or if other health issues arose during the weather emergency. As she monitored the storm's progress and considered precautionary measures like moving equipment to higher ground and securing loose items that could become dangerous in high winds, Eleanor was unaware that the approaching flash flood would bring unexpected visitors to her property, a stranded family whose presence would set in motion discoveries that would transform her financial crisis into an opportunity beyond anything she could have imagined as she sat surrounded by foreclosure notices and calculated the mathematical impossibility of saving her family's farm through conventional financial solutions. The hidden cellar room that Thomas Jenkins had constructed during Prohibition contained not just family supplies of homemade spirits, but historical treasures that would soon attract the attention of the highest levels of the American judicial system, creating opportunities for preserving both Eleanor's financial security and her family's heritage through connections to legal history that had remained undiscovered for over 4 decades in the stone foundation of the farmhouse that had sheltered 4 generations of Vermont farmers through wars, economic depressions, agricultural transformations, and personal challenges that had tested their resilience, resourcefulness, and connection to the land that represented both their livelihood and their legacy. Eleanor Jenkins was about to discover that sometimes salvation comes through unexpected channels, arriving in the form of strangers whose emergency needs create opportunities for generosity that reveal hidden connections and unexpected resources that can transform seemingly insurmountable challenges into pathways toward security, purpose, and the preservation of family heritage that might otherwise be lost to foreclosure, development, or the dispersal of historical treasures that gain their greatest significance when understood within the context of their origin, and the stories of the people who created, preserved, and ultimately discovered their value through acts of kindness during moments of crisis that reveal character, create connections, and sometimes change the course of lives that had seemed destined for loss and displacement. It was 10:23 p.m. on that stormy Thursday evening when Eleanor first heard the sound of a vehicle engine struggling against the rapidly rising water on the county road that ran alongside her property. The rain had been falling in sheets for nearly 4 hours, transforming the usually placid stream into a churning torrent that had already overflowed its banks and was creeping across the lower sections of her eastern fields. The National Weather Service had upgraded the flash flood warning to an emergency declaration, reporting that several bridges in Caledonia County had already been washed out and that water levels were rising at rates unprecedented in the region's recorded history. Eleanor moved to her front porch despite the driving rain, holding a powerful flashlight that she swept across the road where the sound of the laboring engine had been replaced by voices calling for help. The beam illuminated a late-model SUV with Massachusetts license plates that had slid partially off the road into the drainage ditch, which was now filling rapidly with floodwater that had already reached the vehicle's door handles. A man was standing on the roof of the SUV, helping a woman and 2 children climb up from the passenger compartment as water continued to rise around the stranded vehicle. "Over here!" Eleanor called, her voice competing with the storm's fury. "Get away from the vehicle and come toward the light. The ground rises toward my house." The family on the SUV roof turned toward Eleanor's voice and flashlight beam, the father making quick calculations about their best route to safety as water continued to rise around their stranded vehicle. He helped his wife and children, a boy who appeared to be about 10 and a girl who seemed slightly younger, slide from the SUV roof into waist-deep water, forming a human chain with the father in front breaking the current, the children in, the middle and the mother at the rear, ensuring no one was swept away in the rapidly flowing floodwater. Eleanor maintained the flashlight beam on their position, providing a beacon that guided their progress as they struggled through water that continued to deepen and flow more forcefully with each passing minute. The family moved with the deliberate care of people who understood that panic would only increase danger, the father testing each step before committing his weight and continuously checking the security of his grip on his son's hand as they navigated the flooded roadside toward Eleanor's property. After what seemed an eternity, but was actually about 15 minutes of careful progress through the floodwater, the family reached the elevated driveway that led to Eleanor's farmhouse, where the ground rose steeply enough to provide safety from the still rising water that had transformed the county road into a flowing river. As they climbed onto the gravel drive, Eleanor could see that they were soaked, shivering, and clearly traumatized by their narrow escape from a vehicle that was now almost completely submerged in the deepening floodwater. "Come inside quickly," Eleanor said, leading them toward her farmhouse, where light spilled from windows onto the wraparound porch. "We need to get you warm and dry before hypothermia becomes a problem." The family followed Eleanor into her kitchen, where the contrasting warmth made their wet clothes feel even colder against skin that had been chilled by prolonged exposure to floodwater that had originated as mountain snowmelt before being released by the heavy rainfall. Eleanor quickly assessed their condition with the practiced eye of a former combat nurse who had treated hundreds of traumatized and injured patients in field hospitals during the Vietnam War. "The bathroom is down that hallway," she said, pointing toward a door off the kitchen. "There are clean towels in the cabinet, and I'll bring you some dry clothes. We need to get everyone out of those wet things immediately." While the family took turns using the bathroom to remove their wet clothing, Eleanor gathered potential replacement garments, some of her own flannel shirts and sweatpants that might work for the mother despite being somewhat large. Old work clothes left by her nephew during his last visit that could serve for the father, and T-shirts that could function as nightgowns for the children until their own clothes could be dried. She also started a pot of soup heating on the stove and set water boiling for hot tea, remembering field hospital protocols for treating potential hypothermia and shock. When the family returned to the kitchen wrapped in towels and blankets, Eleanor provided the dry clothing options and directed them to change while she prepared hot beverages and soup that would help raise their core body temperatures. She worked with the efficient movements of someone accustomed to emergency situations, her own financial crisis temporarily forgotten as she focused on meeting the immediate needs of people whose lives had been endangered by the historic flash flood. "I can't thank you enough for your help," the father said when the family had changed into dry clothes and had gathered around Eleanor's kitchen table with steaming mugs of tea and bowls of vegetable soup that she had quickly heated from her stored garden harvest. "I'm Daniel Harrington, and this is my wife Rebecca and our children Matthew and Sarah. We were trying to reach our vacation rental in Danville when the GPS directed us onto what it claimed was a shortcut. By the time we realized the road was flooding, it was too late to turn around, and the current pushed our vehicle off the road before we could reach higher ground." "Eleanor Jenkins," she replied, the economy of her introduction reflecting decades of rural Vermont communication styles that favored directness over elaboration. "You're safe now, and that's what matters. The storm is expected to continue through the night, and from what I could see, the bridge that would take you toward Danville has likely been washed out. You'll need to stay here until morning when we can better assess road conditions and contact emergency services if necessary." As the hot food and beverages began to restore the family's comfort and calm, Eleanor observed them more carefully, noting details that suggested they were not typical tourists visiting Vermont for a weekend of scenic drives and quaint village exploration. Daniel Harrington appeared to be in his late 50s, with the carefully groomed appearance and measured speech patterns of a professional accustomed to formal environments. His wire-rimmed glasses, now drying on a kitchen towel, and his precise diction suggested an academic or perhaps legal background that contrasted with the practical communication styles that characterized most of Eleanor's rural community interactions. Rebecca Harrington seemed slightly younger than her husband, with an air of contained composure that was reasserting itself as the immediate trauma of their flooding experience receded. She spoke to her children with the patient clarity of an educator, helping them process their frightening experience by encouraging them to express their feelings while providing reassurance about their current safety. Her occasional references to cases and briefs during conversation suggested a professional background that might be related to her husband's work. The children, Matthew and Sarah, were polite and articulate beyond what Eleanor typically observed in young visitors to the farm, asking thoughtful questions about the historic farmhouse, expressing concern about their school materials that had been in the now submerged vehicle, and demonstrating resilience that suggested they had been raised with both high expectations and consistent emotional support. Matthew had mentioned a debate competition scheduled for the following week, while Sarah had expressed concern about completing a science project that had been interrupted by their vacation travel. "If you don't mind my asking," Eleanor said, as she refilled their soup bowls, "what brings you to this part of Vermont? Most vacation rentals are closer to the ski areas or around Lake Champlain, not in the Northeast Kingdom." Daniel and Rebecca exchanged a glance that suggested the question touched on considerations they hadn't planned to discuss with strangers. After a moment's hesitation, Daniel responded with careful precision that revealed information while maintaining certain boundaries. "I'm conducting research for a book on rural legal traditions in New England," he said, "particularly focusing on how constitutional interpretations have been applied and sometimes adapted in agricultural communities. The Northeast Kingdom has some interesting historical cases involving property rights, water access, and agricultural regulations that provide useful examples for my work." The explanation was plausible, but delivered with a carefulness that suggested it might be partially true, while omitting aspects of their travel purpose that Daniel preferred not to share with someone he had just met. Eleanor nodded acceptance of the explanation without pressing for details, respecting their privacy, while noting the professional background that seemed increasingly evident in their conversation. "Ms. Jenkins," Rebecca said, changing the subject, "Matthew noticed some military photos in your hallway. Were you in the service?" Eleanor nodded, the simple gesture conveying both confirmation and a certain reticence about elaborating on experiences that most civilians found either uncomfortably disturbing or superficially fascinating without true understanding. Army Nurse Corps, 1971 to 1975, served at the 95th Evacuation Hospital in Da Nang during the last years of Vietnam. Matthew's eyes widened with genuine interest rather than the morbid curiosity that sometimes characterized young people's reactions to Vietnam veterans. "We're studying the Vietnam War in history class," he said. "Our teacher was a Marine who served there. He says most Americans don't understand what it was really like or why so many veterans had trouble when they came home." Eleanor studied the boy's face, recognizing sincere interest rather than the performative attention that adults sometimes encouraged in children meeting veterans. "Your teacher is right," she said after a moment. "It was a complicated time in a complicated place. The textbook version rarely captures what it felt like to be there." "Is that when you were injured?" Sarah asked, gesturing toward the cane that Eleanor had leaned against her chair, her directness reflecting the honesty that adults often found simultaneously refreshing and mildly uncomfortable in children who had not yet fully absorbed social conventions about discussing physical disabilities. "Sarah," Rebecca began, her tone suggesting a reminder about conversational boundaries, but Eleanor waved away the concern. "It's fine," she said to Rebecca before turning to Sarah. "Yes, I was injured during a rocket attack on our hospital compound in 1974. Shrapnel damaged my left leg. Most days it's just stiff, but when the weather changes it can be quite painful." "Is it hurting now?" Sarah asked, her expression showing genuine concern rather than mere curiosity. "The weather is really bad." Eleanor smiled, appreciating the girl's perceptiveness and empathy. "Yes, it's definitely letting me know about the storm, but I've had nearly 50 years to get used to it, so I manage. The farm keeps me moving, which the doctors say is the best medicine even when it hurts." The conversation continued as the storm raged outside, the wind driving rain against the windows while thunder periodically rattled the old farmhouse's wooden frame. Eleanor found herself sharing more about her farming operation and family history than she had initially intended, perhaps because the immediate crisis of helping the stranded family had temporarily pushed aside her habitual privacy, or perhaps because there was something about the Harringtons that inspired unusual trust. Daniel expressed particular interest in the farmhouse's history, asking detailed questions about its construction, modifications over the decades, and the family stories. associated with different architectural features. His questions seemed motivated by more than polite conversation or academic research, showing a precision and focus that suggested specific knowledge he was seeking to confirm rather than general information about rural Vermont architecture. The foundation is quite unusual for a farmhouse of this period, he noted after Eleanor had mentioned that her great-grandfather had built the original structure in 1903. Most Vermont farmhouses from that era have fieldstone foundations, but yours appears to be dressed granite block. That would have been considerably more expensive and labor-intensive. Eleanor was impressed by the observation, which demonstrated more specific knowledge of historical Vermont construction techniques than most visitors displayed. My great-grandfather. William apparently insisted on the granite foundation because he wanted the house to last for generations. Family legend says he worked extra shifts at the granite quarry in Barra for 2 years to earn enough for the stone and to hire a skilled mason to set it properly. And the cellar? Daniel asked, his tone casual, but his attention focused. Does it extend under the entire house? The question seemed oddly specific, but Eleanor attributed it to Daniel's apparent interest in historical architecture. Most of it, yes. The original cellar is under the main section, with a newer part that was added when my grandfather Thomas expanded the house in the 1920s. It's still functional for storing preserves and root vegetables, though I don't use it as extensively as previous generations did before modern refrigeration. As midnight approached and the storm showed no signs of abating, Eleanor prepared sleeping arrangements for the Harrington family, making up the guest bedroom for Daniel and Rebecca and arranging the living room sofa and a roll-away bed for Matthew and Sarah. The old farmhouse had ample space for visitors, though Eleanor rarely hosted overnight guests since her nephews had grown up and her participation in community activities had decreased as her financial situation had worsened. I apologize that the heating is uneven, Eleanor said as she provided extra blankets. The original portion of the house still has the old radiator system, while the addition has baseboard heat. Both work reasonably well. But a house this age has its quirks, especially during storms when the power might be unreliable. Please don't apologize, Rebecca said warmly. You've been extraordinarily kind to take in strangers during an emergency. We're grateful for your hospitality and would be comfortable even without such thoughtful accommodations. As Eleanor prepared to retire to her own bedroom, Daniel approached her with an expression that suggested he had been contemplating a question throughout the evening, but had been waiting for an appropriate moment to raise it. Miss Jenkins, he began, I couldn't help noticing the foreclosure notices on your table when we first came in. I hope you don't mind my mentioning it, but I have some experience with rural property law and financing. If you're comfortable discussing it, I might be able to suggest some options you haven't considered. Eleanor felt a momentary tension between her private nature and the reality that her financial crisis was now obvious to these strangers who had seen the documents spread across her kitchen table. After a brief hesitation, she decided that pride was a luxury she could no longer afford. If there was any possibility that this unexpectedly knowledgeable visitor might offer insights that could help save her farm. The situation is straightforward, but seemingly impossible, she said, her tone matter-of-fact rather than self-pitying. 3 consecutive years of crop failures due to weather events have left me 6 months behind on the mortgage. The bank has set a deadline of 21 days, now 20, to bring the account current with a payment of $2,900, or they'll proceed with foreclosure. My income from Social Security and VA benefits covers about 3/4 of my monthly expenses, and I've exhausted all emergency assistance programs that might help with the shortfall. Daniel listened with focused attention, occasionally asking clarifying questions about the specific terms of her mortgage, the legal notices she had received, and the assistance programs she had already explored. His questions revealed sophisticated knowledge of financial regulations, veterans affairs benefit systems, and agricultural support programs that went far beyond casual interest or general awareness. Have you explored the Rural Veterans Agricultural Training Exemption under the 2023 Farm Support Act? He asked, referencing a provision so specialized that Eleanor had never heard of it despite her extensive research into potential assistance programs. No, she admitted. I'm not familiar with that program. Daniel nodded thoughtfully. It's a relatively new provision and not widely publicized. It provides temporary mortgage forbearance for veterans operating family farms who have experienced weather-related crop failures. The application process is somewhat complex, but it could potentially give you an additional 6 to 9 months to resolve the arrears without immediate foreclosure risk. Eleanor felt a momentary flicker of hope, quickly tempered by the realization that even a 9-month extension would only delay rather than resolve her fundamental financial problem unless her agricultural production dramatically improved or she found additional income sources. Still, more time would at least provide opportunity to explore options that the current 20-day deadline made impossible to consider. I appreciate the information, she said. I'll look into it first thing tomorrow if the phones and internet are working after the storm. I'd be happy to help you navigate the application process, Daniel offered. It's the least I can do in return for your assistance tonight. As Eleanor finally retired to her bedroom, leaving the Harrington family settled in their temporary accommodations, she found herself contemplating the strange circumstances that had brought these particular visitors to her farm during a flash flood, on the exact evening when she had been confronting the seeming impossibility of saving her family property from foreclosure. Daniel's unexpected knowledge of specialized veterans' agricultural programs seemed almost providential, though Eleanor's practical Vermont nature made her cautious about expecting too much from what might simply be a temporary reprieve rather than a permanent solution. The storm continued throughout the night, rainfall accumulating to historic levels that transformed streams into rivers and low-lying fields into lakes throughout Caledonia County. Eleanor slept fitfully, awakened periodically by particularly violent thunder or by pain in her injured leg that intensified with the barometric pressure changes accompanying the storm system. During her waking moments, she found herself alternating between practical considerations about potential flood damage to her fields and equipment and more philosophical reflections on the strange intersection of crisis and opportunity that the storm had created by bringing the Harringtons to her property. Around 5:30 a.m., Eleanor was awakened by unusual sounds from the direction of her kitchen, movement and quiet voices that suggested at least some of her guests were already awake. Despite the early hour, concerned that they might need assistance or that the storm might have created new emergency conditions requiring attention, she dressed quickly and made her way down the hallway, noting that the power was still functioning despite the storm's intensity. As she approached the kitchen, Eleanor could hear what sounded like Matthew's voice asking questions, and Daniel responding in the patient, detailed manner she had observed the previous evening. Their conversation became clearer as she neared the doorway, with Matthew apparently inquiring about a historical legal case and Daniel providing context about judicial precedents and constitutional interpretations that seemed remarkably sophisticated. For what Eleanor had assumed was casual early morning conversation between father and son. But why would Justice Marshall have taken that position when it seems to contradict his earlier opinion in the Charleston Harbor case? Matthew was asking as Eleanor entered the kitchen, finding him seated at the table with Daniel, both holding mugs of coffee that suggested they had been awake for some time. Because constitutional interpretation isn't simply about applying fixed principles, Daniel was explaining. It's about understanding how those principles must sometimes evolve to address changing societal conditions while remaining faithful to the underlying values that... He paused as he noticed Eleanor's arrival. "Good morning, Miss Jenkins. I hope we didn't wake you. Matthew had some questions about his history assignment, and we thought the kitchen would disturb fewer people than the living room where Sarah is still sleeping." Eleanor noticed that father and son had a legal textbook open on the table between them, along with a notebook filled with Matthew's handwriting that appeared to contain far more detailed analysis than would typically be expected for a middle school history assignment. The level of legal discussion she had overheard seemed more appropriate for a law school seminar than a conversation with a 10-year-old boy, regardless of how precocious he might be. "Not at all," Eleanor assured them, moving to the stove where coffee was already prepared. "I'm usually up at this hour to check on the animals and start farm chores. The storm might have changed today's routine, but my internal clock still follows farm time." As Eleanor poured herself coffee, she glanced more carefully at the textbook on the table, noting that it appeared to be a specialized volume on constitutional law rather than a general history text. The book was open to a section discussing the evolution of judicial interpretation regarding property rights, with particular focus on agricultural regulations and water access, precisely the research area that Daniel had mentioned as his reason for visiting the Northeast Kingdom. "How is the storm?" Daniel asked, shifting the conversation away from the legal discussion she had interrupted. "Has the flooding affected your property beyond the road access?" Eleanor moved to the window that overlooked her eastern fields, where pre-dawn light was now sufficient to reveal the extent of flooding that had transformed much of her lower acreage into a shallow lake. The stream that normally defined the eastern boundary of her cultivated area had expanded to at least 10 times its normal width, though fortunately the floodwater appeared to be remaining below the elevation of her barn and equipment storage areas. "The lower fields are underwater," she reported, "but that's happened before, in particularly wet springs. The buildings are all on higher ground, so they should be safe unless the rainfall is far worse than predicted. The biggest concern will be road access. From what I can see, the county road is still flooded and will need to wait for the water to recede before attempting to reach town or to assess whether you can continue to your rental property." Daniel joined her at the window, studying the flooded landscape with the careful attention he seemed to bring to all observations. "It appears the water is no longer rising," he noted. "The rain has slackened considerably since midnight, and the forecast I checked on my phone suggests the worst has passed. The flood warning remains in effect until noon, but no additional rainfall is expected." Rebecca and Sarah joined them shortly afterward, and Eleanor prepared a simple breakfast of oatmeal, toast, and preserved fruit from her cellar stores, food that required minimal preparation while providing substantial nourishment after the stressful events of the previous evening. As they ate, conversation turned to practical considerations about their situation and next steps given the continuing flood conditions. "The cell service is sporadic but functioning," Daniel reported, checking his phone periodically. "I've contacted the rental property owner to explain our situation. They report that the access road to their property is also flooded and likely impassable until tomorrow at the earliest. I've also checked with emergency services, who confirm that multiple roads and bridges in the area are damaged or underwater, with priority being given to emergency medical access rather than tourist travel. You're welcome to remain here until conditions improve," Eleanor offered, the hospitality automatic despite her private concerns about extending their stay when her own resources were so limited. "The guest room is available for as long as needed, and we can make do with what food supplies I have on hand." "That's extraordinarily generous," Rebecca responded, "but we wouldn't want to impose further. Perhaps once the immediate flood danger As past, we could find a hotel in a larger town if our rental remains inaccessible. The nearest hotels would be in St. Johnsbury, Eleanor explained, but from what Daniel has learned about road conditions, reaching there might be challenging. For at least another day. Truly, it's no imposition to have you stay. This old house has sheltered visitors through plenty of Vermont weather emergencies over the past century. As they continued breakfast, Matthew asked if he could explore the farmhouse, his natural curiosity apparently extending beyond the legal discussions that had occupied his early morning conversation with his father. "I've never been in a house this old before," he explained. "Our home in Massachusetts was built in the 1990s, and everything looks the same as other houses in the neighborhood." Matthew has developed quite an interest in historical architecture, Rebecca explained, her tone suggesting both pride in her son's intellectual curiosity and a slight apologetic note for what might be perceived as intrusive interest in Eleanor's private home. "You're welcome to look around the main floors," Eleanor agreed, "though some areas of the old house can be hazardous if you're not familiar with them. The attic stairs are steep, and some of the floorboards in the oldest section need repair. The cellar can be particularly dangerous, with uneven stone steps and limited lighting, so I'd prefer you avoid that area without accompaniment." Matthew's expression registered mild disappointment at the cellar restriction, but he nodded agreement with the safety limitations Eleanor had established. "Thank you, Ms. Jenkins. I'll be careful and stay in the main house areas." As the morning progressed, Eleanor made her way to the barn to tend to her small collection of animals, 6 laying hens, 2 goats that provided milk for her personal use, and an elderly draft horse named Duke that had been her father's working animal, but now served primarily as a companion to the other livestock and an occasional assistant for light-pulling tasks. The barn had remained dry despite the torrential rainfall, and the animals were secure in their stalls and enclosures, showing no signs of distress from the storm beyond the normal restlessness that accompanied extended confinement during bad weather. While Eleanor was completing her barn chores, she noticed Daniel approaching across the farmyard, navigating carefully around puddles and debris that the storm had scattered across the property. He was carrying what appeared to be a legal notepad and was studying the farmhouse exterior with the same focused attention he had directed toward the flooding conditions earlier that morning. "Ms. Jenkins," he called as he neared the barn entrance, "I hope I'm not interrupting your work. I wanted to discuss the Veterans Agricultural Training exemption I mentioned last night, and perhaps help you begin preparing the application materials if you're interested in pursuing that option." Eleanor appreciated the offer while remaining realistically cautious about its potential to resolve her fundamental financial crisis. "I'd welcome your assistance," she replied, "though I'm still not clear how a temporary forbearance would solve the underlying problem unless next season's crops are substantially more successful than the past 3 years have been." Daniel nodded, understanding of her concern. The forbearance is only part of the potential solution. There are related programs for veterans who preserve historically significant agricultural properties, particularly those with structures dating to before 1925 that maintain original architectural features. Your property would seem to qualify based on what I've observed, potentially opening access to preservation grants that could address both the immediate mortgage crisis and longer-term financial stability. As they walked together back toward the farmhouse, Daniel continued explaining potential resources that Eleanor had never encountered, despite her extensive research into financial assistance options. His knowledge of agricultural preservation programs, veterans' benefits, and historical property designations revealed expertise that seemed to extend far beyond what would be expected from a legal academic conducting research on rural constitutional interpretations. Eleanor found herself wondering increasingly about Daniel Harrington's actual professional background and why his family had really been traveling through her remote area during a severe storm warning. His knowledge of specialized legal provisions affecting her specific situation seemed too precisely applicable to be coincidental, raising questions about whether the flash flood had truly been responsible for bringing these particular visitors to her farm, or whether some other purpose might have motivated their presence in the area. As they reached the farmhouse porch, Eleanor's reflections were interrupted by sounds of excitement from inside, where Matthew's voice could be heard calling for his parents with the unmistakable tone of a child who has discovered something unexpected and remarkable. The boy appeared at the door, his expression animated with the particular combination of excitement and urgency that children display when they believe they have found something of genuine importance that requires immediate adult attention. "Dad! Mom!" Matthew called, barely noticing Eleanor's return with his father. "You have to come see what I found. There's a hidden room in the cellar with old books and papers about the Supreme Court." Eleanor felt a momentary confusion, followed by concern that Matthew had disregarded her safety instructions about cellar exploration. But these reactions were quickly overshadowed by surprise at what he was describing. A hidden room in her cellar, containing Supreme Court documents. The description triggered a vague childhood memory of her grandfather, showing her a concealed space somewhere in the old house. But the recollection was fragmentary and imprecise after decades of dormancy. Daniel's reaction to his son's announcement was particularly noteworthy, a momentary expression of intense interest, quickly controlled and replaced with a more measured response that suggested he was deliberately moderating his reaction to information that held significant meaning for him. "Matthew," he said with calm authority that contained his son's excitement, "I thought Ms. Jenkins asked you not to explore the cellar without accompaniment. We need to respect the safety boundaries our host has established." "I didn't go into the cellar on purpose," Matthew explained quickly. "I was looking at the kitchen pantry, and there's a door at the back that I thought was just another cupboard, but it opens to stairs going down to a small room below the pantry. That's where I found the hidden room with all the books and papers about the Supreme Court and letters from people with names like Holmes and Brandeis and Frankfurter." Eleanor's confusion deepened as she tried to reconcile Matthew's description with her knowledge of the farmhouse layout. The pantry did indeed have a small door at its rear that she had always assumed was a sealed access to plumbing or electrical systems installed during various modernization efforts over the decades. She had never attempted to open it, having sufficient cellar access through the main entrance for her limited storage needs. Could this door somehow connect to the hidden room from her fragmented childhood memories? Daniel and Rebecca exchanged a glance that contained unspoken communication, some shared understanding that seemed to confirm information or expectations that existed between them. The brief visual exchange reinforced Eleanor's growing certainty that the Harringtons' presence in her remote area during a flash flood was not merely the random accident that their initial explanation had suggested. "Perhaps we should all have a look at what Matthew has discovered," Daniel suggested carefully. "With your permission, of course, Ms. Jenkins. It's your home, and we wouldn't want to intrude on private areas without invitation." Eleanor hesitated only briefly before nodding agreement. Whatever Matthew had found, it was in her house and potentially connected to her family history. If the discovery held some significance that might relate to Daniel's unexpected knowledge of programs that could help save her farm from foreclosure, she needed to understand what they were discussing rather than remaining outside a conversation about her own property. "Yes," she said decisively. "Let's see exactly what Matthew has found and whether it has any connection to my grandfather's work before he returned to farming." He did mention occasionally that his legal training had sometimes proven useful in rural Vermont, though I never fully understood what he meant by that." As they followed Matthew toward the kitchen pantry, Eleanor found herself contemplating the strange intersection of crisis and opportunity that the storm had created, bringing to her farm visitors with specialized legal knowledge at precisely the moment when her financial situation seemed most desperate and now potentially revealing hidden aspects of her family history that might somehow connect to resources that could preserve her property and heritage. The coincidence seemed too precise to be random, suggesting patterns and connections that Eleanor had yet to fully understand, but that might transform her seemingly hopeless situation into an opportunity beyond anything she could have anticipated. When she had first seen headlights struggling through floodwater on that stormy Thursday evening, the small door at the back of Eleanor's kitchen pantry had always been painted the same creamy white as the surrounding walls, blending so seamlessly into the background that it appeared to be merely an architectural detail rather than a functional entrance. As Matthew demonstrated how he had discovered it, reaching behind a rarely moved set of preserving jars to find an almost invisible recessed handle, Eleanor realized that she had never actually attempted to open this particular door during her decades of living in the farmhouse, simply accepting it as part of the background structure that required no particular attention. The door opened with surprising ease, revealing a narrow staircase descending into darkness that was illuminated only by the small flashlight Matthew had apparently used during his initial exploration. Daniel produced a more powerful light from his pocket, the preparedness seeming characteristic of his methodical nature, and led the way down the stairs, with Eleanor following closely behind. Rebecca and Sarah remaining in the kitchen until the safety of the passage could be confirmed. The staircase was solidly constructed of oak treads that showed minimal wear despite their age, suggesting limited use over the decades. At the bottom, they entered a small anteroom approximately 8 feet square with walls of dressed stone, similar to the foundation materials Eleanor had described to Daniel the previous evening. The space was remarkably dry for a Vermont cellar, with no evidence of the moisture problems that typically plagued underground structures in the region's climate. "The main cellar is through that door," Eleanor said, pointing to a conventional wooden door in the anteroom's east wall that connected to the larger basement area accessible from the main cellar stairs. "But I've never seen this section before, at least not that I can recall clearly. My grandfather might have shown it to me when I was very young, but if so, the memory has faded significantly." Matthew pointed excitedly toward the anteroom's south wall, which appeared at first glance to be a solid stone surface without openings or distinctive features. "The hidden room is through there," he explained. "There's a trick to opening it that I found by accident when I was looking at the stonework patterns." The boy demonstrated his discovery, pressing a particular stone that appeared identical to those surrounding it, but that moved slightly inward when sufficient pressure was applied. The movement triggered a mechanical system that caused a section of the seemingly solid wall to slide sideways, revealing an opening to a concealed room beyond the anteroom. The engineering was impressive, particularly considering its age and the fact that it remained functional after decades of disuse. Daniel directed his powerful flashlight into the revealed space, illuminating a room approximately 12 feet square, with walls lined with wooden shelving units containing leather-bound books, document boxes, and what appeared to be carefully organized files and correspondence. A sturdy oak table occupied the center of the room with a wooden chair, positioned as if someone had stepped away briefly from research work with the intention of returning promptly, creating an almost theatrical sense of interrupted activity, frozen in time. "This is remarkable," Daniel said, his voice betraying genuine awe despite his generally controlled demeanor. "The preservation condition is extraordinary. There's almost no moisture damage or deterioration that I can observe." From here, Eleanor stepped into the hidden room with a growing sense of connection to her grandfather Thomas, whose presence seemed to permeate the space through the careful organization of materials and the scholarly atmosphere created by the room's arrangement. The hidden library represented a side of her grandfather that family stories had mentioned, but that she had never directly experienced. The legal scholar who had worked with Supreme Court Justice Holmes before returning to the family farm when his father's health failed. The materials on the shelves appeared to be organized into several distinct categories, each occupying its own section with careful labels indicating contents and chronological periods. One section contained what appeared to be law books and legal references from the early 20th century, while another held leather-bound journals with dates spanning from 1916 to 1958, written on their spines in elegant calligraphy that Eleanor recognized as her grandfather's handwriting from family documents she had preserved. The largest section, however, contained document boxes labeled with the names of Supreme Court justices, including Holmes, Brandeis, Frankfurter, and others whose significance Eleanor recognized from her basic historical knowledge, but whose specific legal contributions remained beyond her non-specialized education. Each box appeared to contain correspondence, drafts of opinions, and personal notes organized chronologically and maintained in acid-free protective sleeves that suggested knowledge of proper document preservation techniques. My grandfather's law school training apparently extended to archival methods, Eleanor observed, noting the careful attention to preservation details that had helped maintain the documents in remarkable condition despite their age and the challenges of Vermont's climate. Daniel moved carefully into the room, his attention focused on the document boxes with an intensity that revealed professional interest rather than merely academic curiosity. Your grandfather appears to have maintained correspondence with several Supreme Court justices long after his clerkship ended, he noted, examining box labels without touching the materials. This represents an extraordinary primary source collection for understanding the private thoughts and legal reasoning of some of the most influential jurists in American history. But why would Supreme Court justices continue corresponding with a Vermont farmer? Eleanor wondered aloud, trying to reconcile this evidence of sustained high-level legal connections with her understanding of her grandfather as a practical agricultural producer who had returned to rural life after a brief legal career. Because Thomas Jenkins wasn't just any former law clerk, Daniel said, his tone suggesting this information held significance beyond casual historical interest. Your grandfather was known in legal circles as the rural justice, an unofficial advisor to several Supreme Court justices on cases involving agricultural law, water rights, and rural property issues. His perspective as both a trained legal scholar and a practical farmer gave him insights that were valued by justices making decisions that would affect agricultural communities throughout the nation. Eleanor felt a momentary disorientation as this new information forced her to reconsider her understanding of her grandfather's life and significance. Family stories had mentioned his legal training and brief Washington career, but had characterized his return to farming as a complete career change necessitated by his father's illness, rather than the beginning of a dual identity that had continued to influence American jurisprudence from the unlikely setting of a Vermont farm. "How do you know this?" Eleanor asked, her tone reflecting both curiosity and a growing suspicion that Daniel Harrington's presence in her remote area during a flash flood might be connected to more than academic research or vacation travel. Daniel hesitated briefly before responding, appearing to make a decision about how much information to share at this stage of their interaction. "Miss Jenkins, I believe I should be more forthcoming about my professional background and the reason for our presence in this area. I am indeed researching rural legal traditions for a book, but that's not my primary occupation." He paused, seeming to choose his next words carefully. "I'm an Associate Justice of the United States Supreme Court. My interest in your grandfather's papers is both professional and historical, as his correspondence with previous justices potentially contains insights into judicial reasoning that aren't reflected in official court records, but that might illuminate the evolution of legal principles that continue to shape contemporary decisions." Eleanor stared at Daniel for several seconds, processing this revelation that transformed her understanding of both her visitor's identity and the potential significance of what Matthew had discovered in her cellar. The man standing before her wasn't merely an academic researcher, but one of the 9 individuals responsible for interpreting the United States Constitution and determining legal precedents that would shape American society for generations to come. "Justice Daniel Harrington," she said finally, the title now connecting to media coverage she had occasionally glimpsed during rare moments of television news viewing. "Appointed 3 years ago after serving on the First Circuit Court of Appeals." Daniel nodded confirmation. "Yes, I apologize for not being entirely forthright about my identity when we arrived. Supreme Court justices try to maintain some privacy during personal travel, and I wasn't certain about the nature or significance of what might be here until Matthew's discovery confirmed information that had previously been speculative." Rebecca, who had descended the stairs with Sarah after determining the passage was safe, joined the conversation with additional context that helped Eleanor understand the full picture of their presence in rural Vermont during a severe storm. "We were genuinely planning a vacation that would allow Daniel to conduct research," she explained. "But the research was specifically focused on locating your grandfather's papers, which have acquired almost legendary status among constitutional scholars interested in the development of agricultural law and rural property rights during the mid-20th century." Eleanor absorbed this information while continuing to survey the hidden room that contained a previously unknown dimension of her family heritage. The revelation of her grandfather's ongoing influence on American jurisprudence created a sense of connection across generations that transcended her previous understanding of her family's significance, which she had measured primarily in terms of agricultural production and land stewardship, rather than intellectual contributions to national legal frameworks. "Ms. Jenkins," Daniel continued, "the materials in this room potentially represent one of the most significant private collections of Supreme Court historical documents outside the Library of Congress or the personal papers of the justices themselves. The correspondence alone would be of enormous value to historians, legal scholars, and institutions dedicated to preserving America's judicial heritage." Eleanor's practical nature immediately recognized the potential implications of this assessment, from someone qualified to evaluate the collection's significance. "Are you suggesting that these papers might have financial value?" she asked directly, her mind connecting this unexpected discovery to the foreclosure crisis that had seemed insurmountable just hours earlier. "Substantial value," Daniel confirmed. "Institutional collectors, including the Supreme Court Historical Society, major university law schools, and national archives, would consider these materials priceless in terms of historical significance and would likely offer considerable financial compensation to acquire them for preservation and scholarly access." Rebecca added practical context that addressed Eleanor's immediate concerns more directly. Private collections of Supreme Court papers with this level of completeness and preservation have been valued in the millions of dollars when they've occasionally become available through estates or family donations. The fact that these materials include correspondence that wasn't previously known to exist would likely increase their value substantially. Eleanor felt momentary dizziness as she processed the implications of what she was hearing. The hidden room that Matthew had discovered by chance during a storm evacuation potentially contained documents worth millions of dollars, enough to resolve her mortgage crisis many times over and provide financial security for whatever years remained in her life. The revelation seemed almost too perfectly timed to be credible, creating a sense of unreality that made Eleanor wonder briefly if she might be experiencing some stress-induced hallucination. "This seems impossible," she said finally. "That Matthew would happen to discover this hidden room containing valuable historical documents at precisely the moment when I'm facing foreclosure, and that a Supreme Court justice would happen to be present to identify their significance. The coincidence stretches credibility beyond reasonable limits." Daniel smiled slightly, acknowledging the improbability while offering a perspective that reframed the situation. "The discovery isn't entirely coincidental," he explained. "Legal historians have known for decades that Thomas Jenkins maintained correspondence with several justices, and rumors about his private collection have circulated among scholars interested in that period of constitutional interpretation. What's coincidental is that our research led us to your property during this particular storm, and that Matthew discovered the actual location of the hidden archive before we had even begun a systematic search." Matthew, who had been quietly observing the adult conversation while continuing to examine the hidden room with the careful attention that Eleanor had noted characterized his approach to new information, spoke up with a child's directness. "I wasn't really supposed to find it yet, was I? Dad was going to ask permission to look for grandfather's papers tomorrow after helping Ms. Jenkins with the veteran farming program application." Daniel nodded confirmation of his son's assessment. "That was indeed our plan. We had arranged the vacation rental as a base for approaching you in a neighborly manner and eventually explaining my interest in your grandfather's legal work. The storm and Matthew's discovery have simply accelerated a process that would have unfolded more gradually under normal circumstances." Eleanor absorbed this explanation, finding it more credible than pure coincidence, while still marveling at the timing that had brought potential financial salvation at precisely her moment of greatest need. The question now became practical rather than philosophical: how to proceed with evaluating, preserving, and potentially monetizing a historical collection that might represent both her family's intellectual legacy and her personal financial salvation. "What happens next?" she asked, her tone reflecting the practical problem-solving approach that had characterized her response to challenges throughout decades of farming and military service. "If these documents have the value and significance you're describing, how would I go about having them properly evaluated and either preserved for historical purposes or sold to address my immediate financial needs?" Daniel's response revealed the careful consideration of someone accustomed to evaluating complex situations with multiple ethical, practical, and legal dimensions. The first step would be professional archival assessment and documentation. I can arrange for Supreme Court historians and archivists to visit as soon as travel conditions permit, bringing proper equipment for preliminary evaluation without disturbing or potentially damaging the materials. These experts would create a comprehensive inventory and condition assessment, he continued, documenting exactly what the collection contains and its state of preservation. This process would typically take several days and would provide the information needed for both historical understanding and accurate valuation without removing anything from your property or disturbing your grandfather's organizational system. Rebecca added information about the financial aspects that addressed Eleanor's immediate concerns. Once the preliminary assessment is complete, you would have multiple options. You could donate the entire collection to an institution like the Supreme Court Historical Society, potentially receiving substantial tax benefits. You could sell the collection to a university, archive, or private collector, or you could maintain ownership while providing scholarly access through a managed research arrangement. Now, for materials of this significance, Daniel noted, institutions often provide substantial financial compensation regardless of which arrangement is selected, recognizing both the historical value and the responsibility of proper preservation. In some cases, special funding has been established specifically for acquiring judicial papers that might otherwise remain inaccessible to researchers or deteriorate without proper archival conditions. Eleanor considered these options while continuing to absorb the transformative implications of Matthew's discovery. The hidden room, representing her grandfather's intellectual legacy, might provide not just immediate financial salvation, but long-term security and purpose that extended beyond her remaining years on the farm, creating connections to historical significance and educational opportunities that would give new meaning to her family's agricultural heritage. If the assessment confirms the collection's value, she asked, how quickly could arrangements be made? My foreclosure deadline is now 19 days away, and even with the Veterans Agricultural Training exemption you mentioned, I would need to demonstrate financial capacity to address the mortgage arrears within a reasonable time frame. Daniel's response reflected both understanding of her urgent situation and the measured consideration that characterized his judicial approach to problem-solving. The Supreme Court Historical Society has emergency acquisition protocols for historically significant judicial papers at risk of dispersal or destruction. Given my first-hand assessment of the collection's significance, I could initiate that process immediately, potentially securing preliminary funding within days rather than weeks or months. Additionally, he continued, a formal letter from a sitting Supreme Court justice confirming the historical significance of the collection and the pending institutional acquisition process would likely persuade Northern Vermont Banking Corporation to extend the foreclosure deadline while arrangements are finalized. Financial institutions typically prefer avoiding negative publicity associated with foreclosing on properties containing materials of national historical significance, particularly when legitimate preservation efforts are underway. The practical pathway Daniel outlined created a sense of tangible possibility that transformed Eleanor's emotional response to the situation from desperate hope to measured optimism. Her military training and decades of agricultural experience had taught her to focus on actionable steps rather than allowing herself to be overwhelmed by either positive or negative emotions during crisis situations. And the clear process Daniel described provided precisely the kind of structured approach that aligned with her problem-solving preferences. I would welcome professional assessment of the collection, Eleanor decided, her tone reflecting the deliberate consideration that characterized her decision-making process. And I appreciate your willingness to help expedite the evaluation given my time constraints with the bank. As they continued examining the hidden room, Eleanor noticed that Matthew had been systematically studying the organization of materials rather than randomly exploring, his approach reflecting a methodical curiosity that seemed beyond his years. The boy was carefully noting how the document boxes were arranged, apparently recognizing patterns in her grandfather's organizational system without disturbing the materials themselves. Ms. Jenkins, Matthew said, his tone suggesting he had made an observation he considered significant. Did you know that your grandfather organized these papers by both justice and by case type? The color coding on the box labels seems to indicate different legal categories: blue for water rights, green for agricultural regulations, red for property boundaries, and several others I haven't figured out yet. Eleanor was impressed by the boy's analytical approach and his ability to discern organizational patterns. that she had not immediately recognized, despite her familiarity with her grandfather's handwriting and general approach to record-keeping. "I didn't notice that." "Matthew, that's very observant of you." Daniel studied the color-coding system his son had identified, his expression reflecting both professional interest and paternal pride in Matthew's perceptiveness. "The categorical organization suggests your grandfather was thinking like an archivist rather than merely preserving correspondence," he noted. "He appears to have been deliberately creating a research resource organized to facilitate topic-specific investigation rather than simply maintaining personal mementos of his judicial connections." The realization that Thomas Jenkins had intentionally preserved and organized these materials as a coherent collection rather than an incidental accumulation of correspondence reinforced Eleanor's growing understanding of her grandfather's dual identity, the practical farmer whose agricultural expertise had informed his continuing contributions to American jurisprudence, creating a legacy that connected rural Vermont wisdom to national legal frameworks in ways she had never fully appreciated. "Dad," Matthew said, continuing his careful observation of the materials, "some of these boxes have personal descent labels. What does that mean in Supreme Court terms?" Daniel's expression registered heightened interest at this observation. Personal dissents are individual justices' private explanations of disagreement with majority opinions, often more candid and detailed than their published dissenting opinions. If your grandfather has preserved personal dissents from multiple justices, that would be extraordinarily valuable for understanding judicial reasoning that never appeared in official court records. As Eleanor absorbed the increasing evidence of the collection's historical significance, she found herself reflecting on the strange intersection of crisis and opportunity that the storm had created, bringing to her farm a Supreme Court justice with specialized knowledge at precisely the moment when her financial situation seemed most desperate, and revealing hidden aspects of her family history that connected her grandfather's intellectual legacy to resources that could preserve both her property and her heritage. The journey from despair to hope had occurred with such unexpected rapidity that Eleanor felt almost disoriented by the transformation of her circumstances. Less than 24 hours earlier, she had been sitting at her kitchen table contemplating the seemingly insurmountable challenge of raising $2,900 within 21 days to prevent foreclosure on her family's century-old farm. Now she stood in a hidden room containing historical treasures that might be worth millions, accompanied by a Supreme Court justice whose position and expertise could help her navigate the process of preserving both the documents and her family property. "Justice Harrington," Eleanor said, using his formal title for the first time, "I'm still trying to process everything that's happened since you arrived during the flood. If you don't mind my asking, why have you taken such a personal interest in my situation? You could have simply informed me about the potential value of these documents and connected me with appropriate resources without becoming directly involved in helping me address my financial crisis." Daniel considered the question with the same careful attention he had directed toward the legal documents. "Ms. Jenkins, your grandfather's influence on American jurisprudence extended far beyond his brief official service as a law clerk. His perspective, as both a legal scholar and a practical farmer, provided insights that helped several justices understand how constitutional principles should be applied to agricultural communities and rural property issues. The decisions influenced by Thomas Jenkins' correspondence affected millions of American farmers and shaped water rights, property law, and agricultural regulations that continue to influence rural communities today," Daniel continued. "His contribution to American legal history deserves recognition, and the farm that informed his unique perspective deserves preservation as part of that legacy." Rebecca added a more personal dimension to the explanation. There's also the matter of how you responded when strangers arrived at your door during a dangerous flood. You didn't hesitate to offer shelter, medical attention, and hospitality, despite your own difficult circumstances. That kind of generosity deserves reciprocation, particularly when we have knowledge and connections that might help address your situation. Eleanor nodded acceptance of these explanations, finding them consistent with her understanding of both professional ethics and basic human decency. The recognition that her grandfather's intellectual contribution to American jurisprudence might have continuing significance beyond her own lifetime created a sense of connection to national history that transcended her previous understanding of her family's heritage, which she had measured primarily through agricultural production and land stewardship rather than legal influence. As they prepared to leave the hidden room and return to the kitchen where Sarah was waiting, Daniel made a final observation that helped Eleanor understand the full significance of what they had discovered. Ms. Jenkins, the materials in this room aren't just financially valuable, they're historically irreplaceable. They contain insights into judicial reasoning and constitutional interpretation that exist nowhere else in American legal archives. Your grandfather preserved these materials because he understood their historical significance, Daniel continued. By maintaining this collection and organizing it as a coherent research resource, he was ensuring that future generations would have access to perspectives and reasoning that might otherwise have been lost to history. He was, in his own way, continuing to serve American jurisprudence long after he returned to farming. This perspective transformed Eleanor's understanding of both her grandfather's life and her own role as the current steward of his legacy. Thomas Jenkins hadn't simply abandoned his legal career when family obligations called him back to farming. He had integrated his legal expertise and agricultural experience into a unique contribution that had influenced American jurisprudence, from the unlikely setting of a Vermont farm, creating a legacy that connected rural wisdom to national governance in ways that continued to shape contemporary society. As they ascended the narrow staircase back to the kitchen, Eleanor felt a growing sense of purpose that transcended the immediate financial relief the discovery might provide. The hidden room represented not just potential monetary value, but a family legacy of intellectual contribution that deserved proper recognition and preservation. Whatever arrangements might be made for the collection's future, Eleanor was determined that her grandfather's unique contribution to American legal history would be acknowledged, and his perspective as a farmer jurist would be remembered as part of the nation's constitutional heritage. The revelation of this hidden dimension of her family history had transformed Eleanor's understanding of her own place in a multi-generational story that connected Vermont agriculture to national governance through the unique dual identity of Thomas Jenkins, the Supreme Court clerk who became a farmer without abandoning his commitment to constitutional interpretation and judicial reasoning. This realization gave new meaning to Eleanor's role as the current steward of both the physical property and the intellectual legacy that together constituted the Jenkins family heritage. 3 hours after Matthew's discovery of the hidden room, Eleanor sat at her kitchen table, surrounded by a very different collection of documents than the foreclosure notices that had dominated the surface the previous evening. Daniel had helped her draft a formal letter to Northern Vermont Banking Corporation, explaining the discovery of historically significant Supreme Court papers on her property and requesting a 90-day extension of the foreclosure deadline to allow proper evaluation and preservation arrangements. The letter, written on Supreme Court stationery and bearing Daniel's official signature as Associate Justice, carried institutional authority that would be difficult for even the most bureaucratic banking officials to dismiss. This should create Sufficient breathing room for the preliminary evaluation process, Daniel explained, as Eleanor reviewed the document before signing her own name alongside his. Financial institutions typically respond positively to communications from federal judiciary offices, particularly when negative publicity might result from proceeding with foreclosure on property containing materials of national historical significance. Eleanor appreciated both the practical assistance and the diplomatic approach Daniel had taken in drafting the letter, which presented the situation as an opportunity for the bank to participate in preserving American legal history, rather than as an adversarial negotiation or request for special treatment. The tone reflected Daniel's judicial experience in finding balanced solutions that acknowledged all parties' legitimate interests while achieving essential objectives. Once the floodwaters recede enough for safe travel, Daniel continued, I'll arrange for Supreme Court historians and archivists to visit for the preliminary assessment. Their evaluation will provide documentation of the collection's historical significance and estimated value, which will strengthen your position in addressing the longer-term financial situation beyond the immediate foreclosure threat. Rebecca, who had been organizing notes from their initial inventory of the hidden room's contents, added practical context that helped Eleanor understand the likely timeline. The preliminary assessment typically takes 3 to 5 days, depending on the collection's size and complexity. Based on what we've observed, your grandfather's papers would likely require the full assessment period given the chronological range and the number of justices represented in the correspondence. And this assessment would happen here, on my property? Eleanor asked, wanting to clarify the practical arrangements before committing to the process. Yes, Daniel confirmed. The assessment team would bring portable equipment for proper documentation, without removing materials from your property or disturbing your grandfather's organizational system. The preliminary work focuses on creating a comprehensive inventory and condition assessment, while ensuring nothing is damaged during the evaluation process. Eleanor nodded acceptance of this approach, finding it respectful of both her property rights and her grandfather's careful preservation efforts. The prospect of having Supreme Court historians and archivists working on her farm created an unexpected connection between her rural Vermont life and national institutions that she had previously viewed as distant and largely irrelevant to her daily existence. As they completed the letter to the bank, Matthew and Sarah returned from feeding Eleanor's chickens, a farm chore they had eagerly volunteered to handle, while the adults addressed the administrative requirements of documenting. The discovery. The children's enthusiasm for agricultural tasks had surprised Eleanor, who had initially assumed urban children from a Supreme Court justice's family might find farm chores unfamiliar or unappealing. Instead, both Matthew and Sarah had approached feeding animals, collecting eggs and helping with basic maintenance tasks with genuine interest and careful attention to Eleanor's instructions. Miss Jenkins, Matthew reported, his expression reflecting the seriousness with which he had approached the responsibility. We collected 16 eggs and made sure all the chickens had fresh water like you showed us. The white hen with the spotted comb seems to be limping slightly on her right foot, but she's still moving around and eating normally. Eleanor was impressed by the boy's observational skills and his attention to details that many adult visitors to her farm might have missed. Thank you for noticing that, Matthew. That's Henrietta, and she occasionally develops minor foot issues from the dampness after heavy rains. I'll check her later and apply the treatment she usually needs if the problem hasn't resolved itself. Sarah, not to be outdone by her brother's farm report, added her own observations. The goats really like the maple leaves we gave them from the branches that fell during the storm. Is that normal food for them, or is it just a special treat? Maple leaves are actually excellent supplemental food for goats, Eleanor explained, appreciating the girl's thoughtful question. They contain nutrients that are beneficial, particularly after stressful events like storms, when the animals might need additional energy sources. You were absolutely right to offer them those fallen branches. The children's genuine interest in farm operations and their careful attention to animal welfare created an unexpected connection between Eleanor's agricultural life and the Harrington family's urban existence. Despite their different backgrounds and experiences, they shared a common appreciation for practical problem-solving and responsible stewardship that transcended the superficial differences in their daily environments. As afternoon progressed into evening, Eleanor prepared dinner for her unexpected guests using preserved vegetables from her cellar stores and fresh eggs from the morning collection. The simple farm meal, vegetable stew with dumplings, fresh bread, and apple compote from last season's harvest, represented the self-sufficient agricultural lifestyle that had characterized the Jenkins family for 4 generations, connecting Eleanor's current farming practices to the heritage she had inherited from her great-grandfather William's original homesteading efforts. During dinner, conversation turned to the practical next steps in addressing both the immediate foreclosure threat and the longer-term preservation of Thomas Jenkins' legal collection. Daniel outlined a comprehensive approach that integrated immediate financial solutions with appropriate historical preservation considerations, his judicial experience evident in the balanced assessment of multiple factors affecting the situation. Once the preliminary assessment confirms what we've already observed about the collection's significance, he explained, you'll have several options for proceeding. The Supreme Court Historical Society has an acquisition fund specifically for historically significant judicial papers that might otherwise be lost or remain inaccessible to researchers. Given my first-hand evaluation of the collection's importance, I can facilitate expedited consideration by the Society's Acquisition Committee. What would that process involve? Eleanor asked, her practical nature focused on understanding specific procedures rather than abstract possibilities. The Society would make a formal offer based on the preliminary assessment's valuation, Daniel explained. For collections of this significance, the financial compensation is typically substantial, likely sufficient to resolve your mortgage situation completely, with significant funds remaining for your future security. Under this arrangement, he continued, you would receive full financial compensation, while the Society would assume responsibility for proper preservation, cataloging, and making the materials available to qualified researchers. Your grandfather would receive appropriate recognition for his contributions to American jurisprudence, and his perspectives would become accessible to historians, legal scholars, and future generations of Supreme Court clerks studying the evolution of constitutional interpretation. Eleanor considered this option, finding it aligned with her developing understanding of her grandfather's intentions in maintaining the collection. And the farm itself? Would this arrangement have any implications for the property beyond resolving the financial crisis? That would be entirely your decision, Daniel assured her. The acquisition would focus exclusively on the document, collection, with no requirements or restrictions regarding the property itself. You could continue farming operations exactly as you have been, or explore other options for the land depending on your personal preferences and physical capabilities. As you consider your longer-term plans, Rebecca added information about an alternative approach that offered different advantages and considerations. Another option would be establishing the farm itself as a historic site recognized for its connection to Supreme Court history through your grandfather's unique role as a farmer jurist, whose agricultural expertise informed constitutional interpretation of rural issues. This approach, she explained, would potentially qualify the property for historic preservation grants and tax benefits beyond the immediate financial compensation for the document collection. Several foundations support the preservation of sites with significant connections to American legal history, particularly those representing perspectives outside traditional urban legal centers. Eleanor found this possibility intriguing, as it aligned with her desire to preserve not just her grandfather's documents, but the agricultural context that had informed his unique perspective on constitutional issues affecting rural communities. The recognition of the farm itself as historically significant would validate the connection between agricultural practice and legal theory that had characterized Thomas Jenkins' dual identity as farmer and judicial advisor. The historic site designation wouldn't require opening your home to public tours or compromising your privacy, Rebecca clarified, anticipating potential concerns. It would simply acknowledge the property's historical significance and potentially provide resources for maintaining its essential character while ensuring its preservation for future generations interested in understanding how rural perspectives influenced American jurisprudence. As Eleanor considered these options, she found herself reflecting on how dramatically her situation had transformed since the previous evening. The foreclosure notices that had represented imminent loss of her family heritage had been replaced by conversations about how best to preserve that heritage while receiving appropriate recognition and compensation for her grandfather's previously unacknowledged contributions to American legal history. It's almost impossible to process how completely things have changed in 24 hours, she acknowledged, her tone reflecting amazement rather than skepticism. Yesterday, I was calculating whether selling my father's antique tractor might generate enough money to delay foreclosure for a few weeks. Today, I'm discussing options for preserving my grandfather's legal papers with a Supreme Court justice, while considering historic site designation for a farm that's been in my family for 4 generations. Daniel nodded, understanding of her perspective. Life sometimes operates on time frames that don't align with our expectations. Some situations develop gradually over decades, with incremental changes that we barely notice, while others transform completely in moments of unexpected discovery or connection. What matters is how we respond to those transformations when they occur, and how we prepare for them before they happen, Eleanor added, her military training evident in her awareness that apparent coincidences often reflect underlying patterns and preparations that become visible only in retrospect. My grandfather spent decades preserving those documents and organizing them for future discovery. He created the possibility that's now unfolding, even if he couldn't predict exactly when or how it would manifest. This realization created a sense of connection across generations that transcended Eleanor's previous understanding of her family heritage. Thomas Jenkins hadn't simply maintained correspondence with Supreme Court justices as personal mementos of his brief Washington career. He had deliberately preserved and organized materials that he recognized as historically significant, creating an archive that would eventually provide both financial salvation for his granddaughter and valuable insights for constitutional scholars interested in how rural perspectives had influenced American jurisprudence. The following morning brought improved weather conditions and receding floodwaters that allowed initial assessment of road conditions throughout Caledonia County. Daniel contacted emergency services to determine which routes were passable and received confirmation that the main highway connecting to Interstate 91 had been cleared for essential travel, though many secondary roads remained partially flooded or damaged from the historic rainfall. We should be able to reach our offices in Boston by this evening if we depart within the next few hours, he informed Eleanor after consulting with local authorities. From there, I can initiate the formal assessment process and arrange for The Supreme Court Historical Society team to visit as soon as road conditions permit safe travel to your property. Eleanor felt momentary concern about her visitors' departure, recognizing that their presence had provided both practical assistance and emotional support during the remarkable transformation of her circumstances. The prospect of returning to solitary contemplation of these developments created a certain apprehension about maintaining the positive momentum that Daniel's expertise and connections had established. Recognizing her unspoken concern, Daniel provided reassurance about continuing support despite his physical departure. "I'll remain directly involved in facilitating the assessment and acquisition processes," he promised. "My office will be in daily contact regarding developments, and I'll personally ensure that both the bank negotiations and the historical preservation arrangements proceed expeditiously, regardless of my location." Rebecca added practical details that addressed the immediate transition period. "We've prepared a detailed contact information sheet with direct numbers for reaching us. The Supreme Court Historical Society representatives who will be conducting the assessment and the legal team that will help manage the bank negotiations during the extension period. You won't be navigating any of this alone." Matthew and Sarah, who had formed a genuine connection with Eleanor during their brief stay, expressed their own commitments to maintaining contact despite the geographical separation. Matthew had developed particular interest in the historical aspects of Thomas Jenkins' legal work and had requested permission to incorporate information about the farmer jurist's influence on agricultural law into his school history project, while Sarah had asked if she could write to Eleanor about the progress of her science research on sustainable farming practices. These expressions of continuing connection across generations and geographical distances created a sense of expanded community that contrasted with Eleanor's previous isolation on the farm. The unexpected flood that had initially seemed like another challenge in an already difficult situation had actually brought people into her life who valued both her grandfather's intellectual legacy and her own continuation of the family's agricultural traditions. As the Harringtons prepared for departure, Daniel presented Eleanor with an official letter he had prepared overnight, addressed to the Supreme Court Historical Society's Acquisition Committee and bearing his formal recommendation regarding Thomas Jenkins' document collection. The letter described the preliminary observations of the collection's contents, historical significance, and preservation condition, concluding with his professional assessment that it represented one of the most important private collections of judicial correspondence and unpublished legal reasoning discovered in recent decades. "This will initiate the formal evaluation and acquisition process," Daniel explained, providing Eleanor with both the original letter and copies for her records. The Society's response to a sitting justice's recommendation is typically prompt, particularly for collections with this level of historical significance and time-sensitive preservation considerations.